morning, everybody. I want to start out by thanking all of you for letting Rodney and I crash your conference. This has been an absolutely fascinating experience for a paleontologist and a film historian. So we really enjoyed being here. And why are we here? Well, we're here to talk our book. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So just, I'm going to start out by just providing a little bit of background about Hofstra and why Hofstra would have anything to do with the subject of this conference. So start with a little map here. So Hofstra University is located in western Long Island in Nassau County. And we're actually pretty close to two significant locations in the history of flight and space exploration. We are not very far from Bethpage, Long Island, the headquarters of the Grumman Aerospace Corporation, and that's where the lunar lander was built. And just about a half a mile from campus, well, actually, about a mile from campus is the site where Charles Lindbergh took off on his transatlantic flight, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. And then just about a half a mile, an easy walk from campus, is an Air and Space Museum called the Cradle of Aviation Museum that commemorates the fact that Long Island was very much involved in the early history of flight. In part because it's relatively flat and it sticks out, kind of into the ocean. So we have these local sites of historical significance. The lunar lander that would have flown on Apollo 18 or Apollo 19 hadn't been decided before those missions were canceled, is in the Cradle of Aviation Museum, and it's one of the few LEMs that still exists on the Earth. In addition to that, the complete LEM, there are a couple of LEM engines that came from Grumman that are also on display, and so it's a really fascinating collection of artifacts around the lunar lander that are just, again, a short walk from campus. The site where Lindbergh took off from is Roosevelt Field, named for Quentin Roosevelt, who was the youngest son of Theodore Roosevelt, and he died in aerial combat in World War I, and an airfield was named in his honor. That airfield is now a mall, and so you can kind of see the parking structure in the back there behind. Supposedly, this is the site, the exact point where the plane became airborne when he took off. But as far as I can tell, he started his takeoff somewhere near the entrance to Macy's. So you guys can talk about whether this site has been properly preserved for posterity. We're also not far from one of the space shuttles, the Enterprise, the sort of test model, which was sited at the Intrepid Air and Space Museum, located in the Hudson River, off the shoreline of Midtown Manhattan. And this is a picture of the Enterprise being transported to JFK, John F. Kennedy International Airport, where it was then trucked into New York City. And so Hofstra has this kind of interesting locational connection to elements in the history of flight and space flight. And for that reason, in 2019, the university decided that they wanted to do something to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Apollo moon landing. And that's kind of where Rodney and I got pulled into this. So I'm going to turn it over to him.
Thank you, Bret. Let me echo Bret's comments of thanks to all of you, but especially to Catherine for inviting us to this conference. It's a real honor to be among you, to be here at Cape Canaveral talking about our book. So as Bret mentioned, Hofstra's Cultural Center in 2019 hosted an interdisciplinary conference. We invited scholars from all over the country to come in and discuss the importance of marking the 50th anniversary of Apollo, and also to look at all the various impacts that we're still feeling today from that historic moment in human history. And so, you know, for all of the reasons Bret just described, Hofstra seemed very well positioned to look at this subject matter. But our Cultural Center puts on a number of conferences throughout the year in and year out. And so this was one of many things that they do, but of course this was a very big deal. And I just want to mention a few things about the conference before we get into the book itself. So really one of the highlights of our professional lives and just my life was the fact that we had Dr. Mae Jemison as our keynote speaker, and Bret and I were able to join her on stage for a Q&A after her wonderful presentation. And I don't know about you, Bret, but I could have died then and there and been very happy with my life. Okay, that's fine. So that was a real highlight. We had some other major speakers, including Douglas Brinkley, whose book had just come out, and so he was one of the featured speakers. We also did a screening of 2001: A Space Odyssey with one of Kubrick's producers, Jan Harlan, in attendance, and so that was another one of the highlights. I also want to mention one of our students, Connie Tace, who was a film student at Hofstra and also was doing an honors project with Bret. When she found out that we were planning this conference, she said, I'd love to do a documentary on the Grumman engineers. And I thought, okay, this is going to be, you know, maybe a 10-minute student film. That'll be great. She produced a 45-minute oral history interviewing multiple retired engineers from Grumman. She even went down to the National Archives and did research there, pulled footage, documents. It's an extraordinary piece of work that actually has played in some film festivals since then. So those are a few of the highlights of the conference that I wanted to mention. And then, of course, we selected some of the top papers from the conference to ask those authors to flesh those out into more full-blown essays that we could incorporate into our book after Apollo. And Bret's going to tell you about a few of the chapters, and then I'll tell you about the rest.
So I like to think that there's something for everybody in this book. We were really pleased with how the conference turned out and just the sort of scope of the papers that were presented. Our main keynote speaker, besides Mae Jemison for the academic part of the conference, was Matthew Hirsch, who's a historian of science and spaceflight at Harvard University, and he gave a really wonderful presentation on the history, kind of a summary of the whole history of the Apollo program. We ran as if to meet the moon, and his kind of major point in this essay is that there was nothing inevitable about the moon landing. And in fact, it was kind of a crazy leap of faith on the part of President Kennedy to even suggest it. Some people think he wasn't really that serious about it, but and maybe regretted making the call after he made it. But as he says in the chapter, if his proposition to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade was a joke, nobody told NASA that it was, and they saw in this a great organizing mission that they threw themselves into. He talks a lot about how the technologies required to do this were really embryonic at the beginning of the 1960s, and that the effort to pull together the expertise and the planning to make this happen really was almost a socialist enterprise that as he says, the United States out-collectivized the Soviets to bring together the industries and the experts to make this to make the moon landing happen. So it's a very interesting take on the whole Apollo enterprise. Another chapter was written by a colleague of ours in the chemistry department, and she talks about some of the interesting chemistry, just basic chemistry behind the Apollo mission. And there are a number of things in this chapter that relate to what people have talked about over the last couple of days. I was very interested in the talk about raising the Apollo engines off of the seafloor, because she discusses the chemistry of combustion of a liquid-fueled rocket and explains very clearly why you need liquid fuel to generate enough thrust to get something heavy into orbit and beyond, because there isn't enough oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere to combust material fast enough. So you need to bring together both the fuel and the oxygen at a really, really high rate and quantity in order to generate the amount of thrust. And one of the interesting things that she points out is that the main technology that had to be developed to do this was cryogenics, was just the ability to store tremendous quantities of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. And that technology didn't exist prior to the Apollo program. We saw a beautiful example of it yesterday in the enormous hydrogen tanks that we were told were the largest hydrogen storage facilities in the world. And then she also talks about spacesuits and the development of the materials that were needed to produce a spacesuit that would retain, an atmosphere around the human body, but still be flexible enough. I mean, the problem in a vacuum with any kind of a pressurized suit is the suit has a tendency to blow up like a balloon. And so NASA had to solve the problem of how you make a pressurized suit and keep it flexible. And a whole bunch of technologies were developed for that, and it's very interesting to see to read about what those were. Another chapter that I found particularly compelling was written by Patricia Rossi, who's an attorney, and she talks about how much of the American public was not very happy about the tremendous expense of the Apollo program. In particular, minorities, the African American community, and there were some pretty big protests against, not so much against the people who were at NASA. They were supportive of the effort, but they were not happy with the fact that all this money was being spent to put Whitey on the moon, as it was expressed in a poem at the time, when there were so much poverty in inner cities. And the point that Rossi makes, which is very interesting, is that the political pressure generated by this over expenditure on the space program was one of the catalysts for Johnson's Great Society legislation, and that the political push to solve civil rights problems was partially fueled by the space program in a sort of an inverse way. And it points out that even Teddy Kennedy gave a speech in the Senate just a few months before Apollo 11 launched, where basically he called for redistribution of funding away from the space program. So when Nixon came into office, Nixon canceled the remaining Apollo flights and basically directed NASA to reduce funding towards low orbit missions that would solve problems on Earth. And that shifted the whole focus of the space program. Another really interesting chapter written by Rosanna Ferrati, another one of our colleagues at Hofstra University, talks about the critical role that immigrants played in the Apollo program and also in the space program since, and different sort of waves of immigrants. The initial immigrants involved in the space program were coming from, fleeing fascism in Europe. But then the United States changed their immigration policy in the 1970s, and another group of immigrants came in, including people from the Middle East, like Farouk El-Baz, who was one of the scientists who trained the Apollo astronauts to make scientific observations from orbit, one of the people who helped turn test pilots into geologists for these missions. And then I'm going to turn it back to Rodney to discuss the remaining chapters.
Okay. Another one of our chapters by Chris Robinson, who is a film studies professor at the University of Arkansas, sort of looks at the prehistory of Apollo and how the idea of space travel was sold to the American public by Walt Disney and Wernher von Braun working in tandem. If you don't know that story, it's really surprising. You probably all know this story. But Robinson looks at, focuses really on Disney's 1955 to 57 TV series, Disneyland, and especially some of the Tomorrowland segments featuring the Man and Space program or episodes, which were a collaboration between one of Disney's animators, Ward Kimball, and Wernher von Braun. And this grew out of a series of articles that von Braun had written in Collier's magazine, imagining what space travel might be like and the reality or the potentialities of space travel. And so it's a fascinating study of that very bizarre collaboration. And you see von Braun on screen in some of these episodes. It's really quite surprising if you're not already expecting that. So it's a kind of a problematic situation with Walt Disney essentially providing a platform for a former Nazi rocket scientist to convey his dreams of space travel to the American public. But there you have it. And so this was really a very important piece of propaganda that arguably made the space program possible. There's even a story that seems to be substantiated that Eisenhower showed one of the episodes repeatedly to some of the top Pentagon brass as a way to sort of get them enthused about the idea as well. Another chapter by Julie Wask, who studies the social impacts of technology and her various works, looks at, her chapter is called Picturing Women in the Space Age, the Impact of the Lunar Landing. And Wask discusses the fact that, despite women not really being part of the space program, really officially up until the 1970s, not really being admitted as astronauts in NASA until the 70s. Nonetheless, we see a lot of images in popular culture, in television, in fashion, in films, imagining women in space. And these images and depictions run the gamut from very problematic, sort of objectified portrayals of women just as decorations to be admired by the male characters in various films, to more serious roles like Uhuru in Star Trek being one of the more famous examples. And of course, Uhuru, that character, and Nichelle Nichols, the actor who plays Uhuru, was cited by Mae Jemison as someone who inspired her as a child to be able to imagine herself going into that program. But Wask takes a really interesting approach to this. She opens with an anecdote about the planned first all-female spacewalk in 2019, which had to be postponed because one of the spacesuits wasn't ready. And so that spacewalk ended up being a woman and a male astronaut. And then a few months later in 2019, the second spacesuit was actually ready. So she takes that little anecdote and anchors her study on that, and then comes back around to it in the end to talk about how spacesuits in recent years have been more specifically designed with women astronauts in mind, and so the chapter closes out looking ahead to what we can anticipate with Artemis 3. Another chapter from a film studies angle is by Allison Whitney, and she looks at the use of IMAX specifically in the documentary Magnificent Desolation, and then also in the dramatized film First Man. And she talks about IMAX as a format, the large format use of IMAX as potentially a way to convey the wonder, the emotional impact of that historic moment of the first walk on the moon, and maybe as a way to suggest maybe what the emotional states of the astronauts might have been like. And she goes into a really wonderful, detailed analysis of the moment in First Man where we get to the moon. So most of the film, First Man, if you've seen it, most of the film is shot on the Super 16 millimeter format, which looks really good. It's a perfectly good alternative to 35 millimeter for a feature film presentation. So most of the film is in that fairly normal, ordinary feature film format. When we get to the moon landing and all of the scenes on the moon, it shifts into IMAX. And so that she really analyzes very well how that shift into the different format gives us as an audience maybe a hint of the kind of emotional impact that might have had on the astronauts, and it immerses us in the moment of what it might have been like to be there. And then as soon as the lunar exploration is over, we go back into the other format. So it's a really wonderful analysis of the use of IMAX, and the use of IMAX as a format to consider how the history of space has been portrayed in films and videos. And then finally, Jamie Spiller, who's a historian, examines the use of the frontier myth as a way that we have looked at the Apollo missions. And he draws a lot on the work of Frederick Jackson Turner and the importance of the frontier in American history and the mythology of American history. And Spiller suggests that frontier myth may not fit so well anymore with the new phase of commercialized and privatized space travel, where we have the preponderance of sort of wealthy space tourists as the thing that's going to propel us to the next stage of space exploration. And so he sort of problematizes that old frontier mythology and suggests that it doesn't really fit anymore, but that we're in a place right now where we need a new mythology of space travel, and we're not quite sure yet what that might be. As a way to sort of sell the general public on the idea that this still needs to be funded by government subsidies and so forth. So again, he talks about the problem of finding a new narrative to excite the public. And I want to close with a quote that he gives us from USA Today from 2010, where that journalist suggests that we are stuck between mythologies. We're not what we once were, but we don't yet know what we will become. And I think that's as good a place as any to end this. Before we take any questions, I just want to really thank Catherine and everyone who has put this conference together. So please join me in thanking Catherine and Jason and James and everybody. Really, it's been wonderful to be here.